So I'm here with John Schmidt from Mayer Brown. You're obviously very experienced in the field of US airports, particularly, I think. Can we start by asking about Midway, which is obviously a topic that has come around a couple of times and has always been of key interest to the airport investment community. The second time round, things didn't work out particularly well. Can you give us a view on what happened?
Well, I've lived through the entire process of the City of Chicago's effort to privatize Midway, and we started actually 6 years ago when the city went to the FAA and got preliminary approval to go forward with the privatization, and I've said to people, there's a standard under the regulations that you're allowed to sort of keep your application going as long as you're making reasonable efforts to carry out the plan. I don't think anyone ever thought 6 years was what could be reasonable efforts, but the second time around, the mayor decided to go forward, began the process. We were conducting what we thought was actually a very positive process, and people were very positive about it. What happened was at the very end of the process, at least what we thought was going to be the very end, one of the two remaining bidders withdrew from the process. We had two shortlisted bidders at that point. The mayor made the conclusion that it was really a political judgment that he couldn't go forward and present the deal successfully to the Chicago City Council without having had competitive bidding down to the end. So it was really that simple, and it was unfortunate because I think the remaining bidder was in fact by all accounts, and once the process had ended, they were willing to tell us really what they were willing to do, was prepared to put a deal on the table that financially was very attractive, and the airlines were very supportive of it, but it just didn't work. It comes down to the fact that at the end of the day, an airport is governed by a political entity, and unless the leaders of that political entity are comfortable not only with the end result but with the process, you can't go forward.
So I'm sure, I mean, it's something that is great disappointment for those who are advising and obviously for those who are bidding, particularly at the end. What if we put Midway aside and just think about the implications for the privatization of US airports in general? What do you think the implications are?
Well, I actually think it would have been much more serious if we hadn't had earlier in the year the successful completion of the San Juan Airport privatization. I was counsel for the government of San Juan, and I've said to people, just at a personal level, as disappointing as Midway was when it didn't go forward, I would have been vastly more disappointing if we didn't know we had been able to complete a major U.S. airport privatization. And I think that's actually very significant in terms of how the market reacts to it. If nothing had happened in the meantime, and the first time around we had a successful deal for Midway and then the financial markets collapsed, if nothing had happened in the meantime and we had gone forward again and it failed again, I think there would be a pretty depressed feeling about the market. I don't actually get that sense. I think there is the positive fact of San Juan, an airport only half the size, but nevertheless a major airport, 4.5 million passengers a year in plane passengers. So, and that transaction has been completed. Everyone involved sees it at this point as a very positive transaction. The government of Puerto Rico is feeling good about it. The airlines, JetBlue, which is the major airline there, couldn't be more enthused about it. So I think, I think Midway is more a disappointment. But I'm hopeful, and I actually think the San Juan completion may turn out to be the more significant fact of recent U.S. airport privatization history.
That's a very good point. What are the benefits, do you think, that taking Puerto Rico, that the airlines see, and for the public sector entity?
Well, the airlines in Puerto Rico saw and see a real need for just basically improved management of that airport. And actually the public entity that managed the Puerto Rico airport, which is the Puerto Rico Ports Authority, itself acknowledged that they were doing a terrible job of it. They had had a whole succession of leaders of that agency. Every time there was a new governor in Puerto Rico, there would be a complete shift over in management, so there was no continuity in management. And it was just badly managed, and I think the airlines see an improvement just in the basic sense of the quality of the airport. Financially, they also get a better deal, because the one thing that private operator is able to do is go in and make a lot more money on the non-aero side of the airport.
Yeah.
That's money that can be used, to effectively reduce airline fees. So the airlines got a deal in Puerto Rico where their total fees are now capped at a level that is a little below where it currently is, and it's frozen for 3 years, and then it goes up only by CPI for the next 15 years. Gives them not only lower rates but predictable rates.
Yeah, indeed.
So they're feeling good about it.
Yeah. It's 20 years. This conference at GAD has been going for 20 years. Airport privatisation, from a European perspective, is something that has a 20-year plus history in various shapes and forms. Why has it taken so long for the US industry to get to a point where private sector involvement as managers and as owners has really, before it's taken off?
I think one big factor is that in the US, control of airports is totally localized. Margaret Thatcher decided to privatize the British airports. She privatized the British airports.
Yeah.
I think Ronald Reagan would have been happy to privatize airports. He doesn't have any airports. There are no federal airports in the U.S. And there are literally hundreds of political entities which operate airports. They tend to be very invested in those airports, and there is no way to make any national decision to privatize airports. In addition to that, the airlines, for a long while in the U.S., were, for reasons that I think are in part historical, very hostile to airport privatization. I think it's in part that the airlines had relationships with those political entities. In many cases, dominant relationships. I was transition chief when Rich Daley was elected mayor of Chicago. At that time, everyone just understood United Airlines runs O'Hare. That's the way to talk about it. If we're going to get a new aviation commissioner, we went and talked to United about it. Now, those kinds of relationships were threatened when people talked about privatization. I think those relationships no longer exist in the same old way. First of all, those airlines have all gone broke once or twice. It reduces your leverage a little bit when you're in bankruptcy, and I think the airports are less dependent on individual airlines, and I also think the airlines have begun to realize privatization could be good for them from a financial standpoint, as it is, for example, for JetBlue, which has really big dollars, 100 million plus present value in reduced rates in San Juan just for JetBlue over the next 15 years. So it's big money for them.
So what would you advise those more localized policy advisors, public authorities? How would you advise them when you see the interest here of investors from all over the world, from Canada, Australia, the Middle East, and more locally in Europe? What would you say to the public authorities? What you can learn from here?
Well, I think they can learn that there is, in fact, a global airport market. That comes as a shock to people in the U.S. But when you begin one of these processes, and all of a sudden you have bidders, from Australia, United Kingdom, Korea. This is truly a global market, and I think that the U.S. airport operators, a few of whom are here, but not a lot of whom, I think need to know that. No one's going to force someone to privatize their airport, but to know that the possibility exists, that there is that kind of market, that I think most of the investors I talk to around here would like to be in the U.S. market. After all, it's the biggest aviation market in the world. It's an economy that's growing. We were just listening to a presentation on how U.S. may be beating anybody's expectations compared to much of the rest of the world. If you have a portfolio of airports around the world, you ought to have U.S. airports in that portfolio, and I think that is the attitude. I think to that extent, it will be helpful and would be helpful for more people from the U.S. to come to a conference like this and see the fact that there's a market there. If they can figure out a way to tap into it, it can be good for everybody.
Well, I'm sure, John, you could do a lot to help on both sides of the equation.
Well, we'd love to be involved in the transactions, but I say we're always eager to promote transactions on the theory. Frankly, there aren't too many people with experience in this area. So if we have transactions, there'll be plenty of work for all of us to do.
Indeed. Okay.